My name is Anthony Herron, and I am a special counsel with Herron, which is a construction and engineering law firm based in Sydney. This is part one of a series of podcasts that provide an update on developments in the law in relation to aluminium composite cladding and how it relates to construction.
Well, thank you very much for attending today and welcome to our presentation on aluminium composite cladding. What I'd like to do is walk you through the series of points that set out in this slide that you'll see above you. Much has been written about aluminium composite cladding, so the purposes of our presentation today is to discuss what it is, what are the good points, why it is a danger, why there has been such tremendous discussion about it, how it has really engaged the policy communities in the public sector space, and also the manufacturers and suppliers who will be caught up with this. But it also forms part of a broader issue which has been the subject of a number of reports. So for example, it often takes a disaster such as a fire for people to suddenly become aware of that you have a problem. There was a fire in 2012 where two young Chinese girls were very badly burnt. One was killed and one jumped to her life, and it was discovered that there were problems in Rockdale with the fire in the unit. That prompted an investigation by the New South Wales government, which ultimately became the report from Michael Lambert, which was commissioned in October 2015. His report made a number of recommendations concerning the regulation and certification of building professionals and certifiers. You have the subsequent fires that happened in 2015, 2017, and more recently the fire in Neo Building 2000 in Melbourne in 2019. Those themselves have created considerable discussion, and we can't forget the fire in 2017 in Grenfell in the United Kingdom, which has resulted in a number of inquiries by the Royal Commission that is currently sitting in phase 2, where the parties are making submissions regarding the choice of design and issues concerning other more important issues, such as ultimate liability of parties. So those would form the subject of our case studies today. We also want to look at who is ultimately responsible for these particular issues, what have been the standard government responses to those, particularly on policy issues, and practically how can we assist our clients when someone walks through the door and asks for our advice, be it a building contractor, be it a certifier, be it a supplier or a manufacturer of aluminium composite cladding. So I think, as our introduction has indicated, aluminium composite cladding, and we'll call it more loosely, building materials and construction, do form a big problem. They have spanned several continents. The slides that you can see above you indicate that we've had fires of similar issues in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Saudi Arabia, in the US. So clearly it is not a problem that is isolated to Australia. There are, however, important takeaways that we can take from understanding a little bit more about what aluminium composite cladding is, how it is made up, why it is being used as a choice of building material, and then how do the policy makers, in other words the government of the day, respond, both at a state and federal level. Let me start with the primary party or primary entity which will determine what are the goals for safety in Australia. BCA, the Building Code of Australia, is set up through the National Construction Code, and that contains minimum safety requirements for health, safety and amenity in public buildings and also in residential design and construction. The two main goals are occupant safety and minimising fire spread. So we need to keep those issues in mind because they have and should inform any discussion about what the future of controversial or unusual building materials and or design will be. So occupant safety and fire spread are important. The National Construction Code also has relevance because it covers new buildings, so new building work, and also where you have building work which has been the subject of amendments to buildings which are currently constructed. Well, the next couple of slides will briefly describe and illustrate what aluminium composite cladding is about. Essentially, you can see from the slide, a series of composite panels. In other words, they are made up of aluminium composite. No, they're made up of aluminium and other metals that are encased in two thinly coated aluminium sheets. They are frequently used for external cladding on the facades of buildings. They may also be used for insulation and signage, and they have enormous ramifications, both from a commercial and residential setting. So as an alternative to the traditional methods of construction and facades of buildings such as timber, wood, metal, concrete, etc., the choice of aluminium composite cladding has been the vogue for the last 20 or so years. In fact, aluminium composite, or the polymers, really was what they've made up of, really are nothing new. They have been developed since the 1920s, so they do have some considerable history of application. You find that there are a number of choices that are given to designers as to the source or the use of aluminium composite claddings. For example, they're low weight. So compared to traditional building materials, they are much lighter in weight. They are also allow for a lower cost because a lot of the composite cladding can be measured up and prepared off-site and then installed on-site. So what you have is time advantages in cost and production, and you also have an ability for the designer or the architect to create an interesting design for the facade or the external elements of the building. They are not the only type of flammable cladding that's used, but aluminium composite cladding have arisen because they have been found to be defective in a number of buildings, which will form the subject of our discussion today in our case studies. So as we've said, the aluminium composite forms, it consists of two aluminium sheets, which are bonded to a non-aluminium core. You can see from the slide that we have illustrations of what the facade looks like. We also have the middle slide where you have the facade with a soffit below it. And the cladding does mean that you have an opportunity to sheathe or encase a building in a much more attractive ability compared to traditional methods of construction. The aluminium composite cladding also is cheaper and more versatile than more traditional methods of construction and building materials. So, having seen the advantages in terms of cost and time, production and efficiencies, let's consider some of the less desirable quantities of aluminium composite panels. The slide indicates that studies have been carried out which indicate what we call the combustibility ratio. In other words, the amount of heat which is released from the burning material divided by the amount of heat needed to ignite it. So essentially what we have is a very high rate of combustibility of the aluminium composite cladding. And ultimately, that is the reason why it is a dangerous product, where you have elements of the aluminium composite which have a high element of the composite cladding itself. It does have or creates an ability for the fires to spread quickly and rapidly, as we're going to see in the case studies. And so that is part of the dangers that have been found following studies following fires in Australia and overseas. A little bit of discussion about the weaknesses or the dangers of the ACP. The slide there shows a photo of the Grenfell fire. If you look at the part of the fire itself, you see that that photo was taken in the course of the fire. Now, the Building Code of Australia does essentially provide for, as I said, two issues. You want to have regard to the occupant's safety. You also want to protect or minimise fire spread. What has been shown in the case studies indicates that from the photo, you can see that the fire is coming up the sides of the building and the facades. And so this is part of the building in Grenfell where it was covered in the aluminium composite cladding. They're made by a number of different manufacturers. Principally in Australia, we have them sourced from overseas. Italy, Germany, and Southeast Asia. That is their attraction in terms of time and cost. They're produced at a cost which is considerably less than we could produce in Australia. However, that is the weakness in aluminium composite cladding. Part of its rigidity, in other words, being able to be used in construction, is its strength. But also because of its makeup, is increasingly found to be in danger of being delaminated. And that's part of what happens when you have fire. So the combustibility ratio of the aluminium composite cladding is part of its danger, weakness as a product. The next couple of slides just indicate part of the weakness with it. The essential element of the aluminium cladding is that when the aluminium melts, it exposes the building itself and the inner core to combustibility. So in other words, this is the key element to creating a fire. Without a fire source, you don't have a fire problem. That is, on the other hand, the weakness of having or the way in which the aluminium composite cladding or panelling is constructed. It can be used, as I said, on external and vertical and horizontal elements. It can also be used as a capping to a building to create so it's easily molded to create a sheath or a cover for the building external elements itself. That has ultimately been found to be its weakness. And ultimately, the flames have been found in studies to rise up and down the building. So in other words, the traditional method of trying to contain a fire within a single source, so if you have a fire which starts in one unit, the traditional method of construction and the idea behind the Building Code of Australia is to try to protect the occupants, to try to contain the fire within one single unit or shell. ACP, as it's been found in these fires, and the case studies will show, makes a mockery of that very issue because it has enabled fire to spread rapidly from one element to another. So in other words, from one unit to another in a very short space of time, which has created problems for the fire rescue services in trying to understand how to actually deal with it. How do you extinguish flames? How do you deal with the ensuing smoke and toxic fumes? How do you try to work out a program of evacuation of the occupants? Traditionally, the fire occupation or evacuation is done so that in the ordinary course, after the fire alarm is sounded, the fire rescue services turn up. It won't be at that time any provision for fire evacuation, simply because when you open the doors and you start to introduce oxygen into the building itself, that creates an opportunity for fire spread. That was ultimately the challenge found by Grenfell. In other words, how do we work a system where we have the spread of the fire, which occurs rapidly? Do we fight the fire internally? Do we fight the fire externally? How do we actually deal with that? That's part of the particular issues facing designers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. In our next podcast, I will be discussing the lessons that can be learned from both the Grenfell fire in the United Kingdom and the La Crosse and Neo 200 fires in Melbourne. If you would like some information in relation to combustible cladding and construction defects, please visit the articles on our website and also download our ebook on cladding updates. rights. We look forward to connecting with you in our next podcast.